Ethelbert Miller, coming up in just a moment with On the Margin. You are in tune to WPFW Washington.
Welcome to On the Margin with Ethelbert Miller. My guest today is James Early. James Early is a former Assistant Secretary for Education and Public Service at the Smithsonian Folklife Center. While at the Smithsonian, he was also the Director of Cultural Heritage Policy Center for Folklore, Life, and Cultural Heritage. James Early is a former interim director of the Anacostia Museum. How are you doing this morning, James?
I'm doing good, brother. Good to be with you.
Okay, we're in the middle of a fundraising drive, and people will be calling 202-588-9739 or 1-800-222-9739. James, on July 16, 2024, the scholar, singer, composer, and activist Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagon died. She was a founding member of the SNCC Freedom Singers, a founder of the singing group Sweet Honey in the Rock. Dr. Reagon created the program in Black American culture at the Smithsonian Institution. During her lifetime, she received the MacArthur Foundation Genius Award, as well as the President Medal for the contribution to public understanding of the humanities. James, what I want to do, begin our program, is by reading an excerpt from James Forman, The Making of Black Revolutionaries. And I think this is still one of the best books written about the Civil Rights Movement. Forman served as Executive Secretary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee from 1961 to 1966. And this is what he writes about Bernice. Your understanding of the historical process of liberation keeps you singing. You have been able to forge new words to meet changing conditions. You have grown with the demands of the struggle. Your life is forever unfolding as the lives of your people unfold and move down the path of liberation. Your songs today of Africa fit the transition in which we find ourselves. From the dusty roads of Albany, Georgia, through the cities of the United States, from many years ago and for many years to come, the music you make is only a reflection of your total understanding. Through the years, your love for humanity and hatred of oppression will keep you singing. Comment on that, James Early.
Well, one, I think you're correct that this is one of the most important books on the civil rights movement. And I think it's one of the most important documentations, firsthand documentations about the role and presence and singularity in terms of contributions of Bernice Johnson Reagon. He, just to quote him again, and when the call came to protest the killings, you were up front. You led the line. Your feet hit the dirt pavement with a sureness of direction. You walked proudly onward, singing, "This little light of mine," and the people echoed, "Shine, shine, shine." It illustrates how grounded Bernice was in community. Foreman also notes that prior to the Albany movement, the freedom songs had not been a consistent part of, quote unquote, the resistance struggle, but it was, as he says, the unforgettable voice of Bernice Johnson Reagon leading the way herself, led by the awakened spirit of an awakened people. So I think we need to look at Bernice as a social construct that had a high individual profile. And I think Foreman captures that. And I would refer people to look at that book because it also indicates that Bernice was always grounded in a consciousness and a documentation about the community in which she grew up, the community in which she was embedded. And so her scholarship, if you will, her research and documentation really predates her formal education, both at Albany State at 16, where she ended Albany State, and her PhD work at Howard University starting in 1971.
Let me ask you a large question. How important are songs and music when we discuss social movements?
Fundamentally important because, and Bernice is an exemplar of that, as are many others, but songs reflect the sensibility, the ways of knowing and doing, the emotional character of grassroots communities. When we talk about folk songs or community-based culture, they are historical reflections of the ways of knowing and doing that's characteristic of a community. And in that context, then we have highly individualized expressions, as we saw in the case of Bernice.
One of the things I was reading that Bernice Reagon was responsible for doing, at least she talks about doing it, and that is singing and changing the ear in a space.
Yes. Bernice had a saying that that Dr. Amy Horowitz likes to recite, that if something is missing, it's probably the sound of your own voice. And so agency, self-agency, self-reflection in relationship to others was something that Bernice was very much about. And so that song and hearing are, two basic sensory elements of human society. She raised a fundamental level of making sense and acting on that common sense, if you will, coming out of community.
With what our listeners might want to look at, Bernice Reagon had a very long essay, Let Your Light Shine, Historical Notes, which is in the book We Who Believe in Freedom, Sweet Honey in the Rock, Still on the Journey, which is an excellent analysis in terms of interpretation of what she's doing. And one of the things that she says in that essay, James, I want you to comment on, she talks about having a conversation with the audience, that when Sweet Honey in the Rock is singing, it's a conversation.
Well, I think absolutely right. In the first instance, the founding of Sweet Honey as she used to like to say very directly, a community-based organization, coming out of the Last Colony Theater, where she was asked to come and deal with voice training for the actors. And if you think about Sweet Honey in the Rock, each of those individual women have highly individualized voices. And so while Bernice was the founder convener, each had their own voice. Dr. Isai Barneswell, comes to mind, a scholar in her own right, Carol Maillard, among Louise Robinson, others who had their own voice. In Process was a larger group that still exists here in Washington, sort of like a sewing circle of women coming together to give voice of their own individual being, not necessarily to go on stage, although In Process still is the foundational community-based element out of which Sweet Honey in the Rock and many women came through that process. So this really captures, again, the social context of Bernice Reagon and then her singular profile in that context.
Well, let's talk about the Young Chambers early. To take you back to 1967, you meet Bernice Reagon down in Atlanta. Talk about that meeting and how did you see her when you first met her? And then was she talking about things that had happened at Albany State?
Well, when I first visually saw her, and I'd be on the corner with wine drinkers at Morehouse, and we would.
I know that. Probably with what wine, probably was Ripple or something like that.
We were doing community-based research, if you will. We would see her leaving Spelman College, striding across Morehouse's campus. Wait a
minute. Let me interrupt you. Is that like Morehouse men looking at the Spelman women?
Well, in a manner of speaking, we were, and there would be the whispers. You see that woman? She's been in jail. She was already a resonant presence, a resonant figure in the minds of many young people who didn't really grasp the full sense either of the civil rights movement of who she was, but we knew that she was distinguished. And she would be headed to the edge of Morehouse's campus, where she lived in a house with her two children, Toshi Reagon, now the renowned composer, songwriter, and her son, Kwame Reagon, who's out in California, with a joint stairwell connected downstairs where Dr. Vincent Harding, who was head of the sociology department at Spelman, and his wife and two children lived. And so when I saw her physically, I could feel the power, because I come from early part of my life, a rural background in Florida. I knew that she was sort of the earth of community, if you will. Later, I came to know her around 1967. I really began to engage her, or really she began to engage me. Bernice always looked around of who was in her community, and when she needed something done or needed to know something, she drew on the immediate people and gave them tasks and assignments. And I was one of those people, fortunate enough to be tasked. And so then I realized that she was more than a singer, more than a civil rights activist. She always described herself as a freedom singer, but she was already doing historical research with Dr. Stephen Henderson, whose book you, along with two other editors, are coming out on his life. Stephen Henderson was head of the English department at Morehouse. And she and Stephen Henderson started to do something called a folklife festival of traditional blues singers and culinary traditions and the like.
Well, let me take you back for something, James, because you're talking about Bernice, but I want to also talk about you. Did Bernice pull out, she's the activist in James Early? You're hanging out on the corner drinking the wine and stuff. Did she see something in you and say, brother, follow me, get more involved politically?
That was not the narrative, but that's a good summary. Me, as well as many others that she drew in. She called me one day when I was working at the Martin Luther King Documentation Project. Vincent Harding heard I needed a job after I had been, my degree had been suspended from Morehouse for taking over the administration building. Where Bernice, hearing that on radio, the taking over the administration building, she was out in the community. She came up to the administration building, came in, and made her contribution in the hallway singing a song called "The Black Musician." Magician. Later, she called me when I was at the MLK Center where her sister was working. We were working in the archives on SNCC papers, and asked if I had access to a tape recorder, if I knew how to use it. She wanted me to come and tape a Black Songwriters Conference. And I was really struck, why me? So she also introduced me to the Smithsonian, and she's the one who really made sure that I was hired there to do research. We were fellow graduate students, Ford Foundation, PhD fellows at Howard. We came to Washington in 1971. And she also insisted that I become the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Education and Public Service, along with Ralph Renzler, whom she had long collaborated, starting back prior to 1970. But in 1970, Ralph asked her to come and curate a program at
okay, I'm gonna stop you right there. I want to take you back. Okay, I'm gonna go back. Okay, in your youth, but I want to go back. Bernice was the daughter of Reverend Jesse Johnson, a Baptist minister. Would it be accurate to say that without the Black church, we may not have a Bernice Reagon?
I think that would be fundamentally accurate, because it was out of the Black church and where she developed her ways of analyzing her life and the community life and the national life and the global life that she was stepping into. And she framed that very explicitly about a congregational methodology.
Let me make a connection here and see this. I'm thinking here aloud. I'm looking at this coming out of the church. This is the 100th anniversary of James Baldwin's birth. Okay, Baldwin comes out of the church. And if you hear him singing, Precious Lord, you know that Baldwin comes out of the church.
Right.
But Baldwin comes out of church in Harlem. What does it mean for Bernice Johnson Reagon to come out of a rural church, a church that has no piano?
Well, you're talking about the Black Belt South, where the largest concentration of Black people and the super exploitation of their labor in the cotton and tobacco fields and the like came out. This is where Black people were grounded with many continuations of African ways of knowing and doing. And in that church where there was no piano in Mount Early Baptist Church, which was about 80 miles from where I was growing up in Tallahassee.
That's not named after you either, right?
No, not it's not named after an about atheist, but it always resonates when I'm thinking about her and when I see that and the relationship that she and I developed over the years. So coming out of the Black Belt South, coming out of those rural communities where the terrorism of American apartheid, the brutality, the undermining of our humanity, the rape of our women. She was thrown out of Albany State because she challenged white men trying to come and pick up young Black women students there. That is quite different from growing up in Harlem. And so, yes, the Black Belt South and that grounded community, and where song was something that bonded and everybody had a voice. This is the congregational methodology that she talks about. And there was no piano. And so it was the foot and the hand that gave the rhythm. And she has documented this in her own voice. I should say here that for the last 5 years, we've been trying to get the Smithsonian Institution to look at Bernice Reagon as a scholar, unsuccessfully. which is a reflection that many legacy institutions fail to deal with their own legacies. But we are hopeful that someone will explore her as a scholar, because we see her as someone in voice and her song. You know, she was also a playwright who wrote about Washington, D.C., a day of life of people, about Anacostia and ordinary, everyday, community-based people.
Mm. Well, you know, we're here at the radio station. We're not in church, but we can bring in one of those little angels, Katia Stick, to join us. Katia, are you there?
Wow, what an introduction. I am here. Good morning.
we know you have little wings hidden.
Well, good morning, gentlemen. This is a really fascinating discussion about Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagon, and I'm learning things, James, that I did not know. I did not know she was a playwright, for instance. That is the first time I've heard that. And this is the kind of conversation, the kind of connection that Ethelbert Miller brings us every Thursday on the margin. And if you are appreciating this conversation like I am, and like many, not only across the region, but also around the world, because we are streaming. If you're appreciating this conversation right now and appreciate what Ethelbert brings to the air and what On the Margin is, then give us a call, pledge your support, 800-222-9739. We have a $500 goal this hour, and we can do that. You can consider becoming a sustaining member if that works better for your budget. That's where you have $10, $20, $50, $100 a month, and you can stop that draft anytime from your bank account if you like. But we hope that you would at least consider a year of that. You can also use Cash App, $ WPFWFM, to pledge your support to On the Margin. However you choose to connect with us this morning, help Ethelbert meet his goal. I won't be able to honestly look at him if we don't do that. So he will hold it against me. So please help
I'll take away your wings.
Exactly. You heard it first. So 800-222-9739 or WPFWFM.org. We are joking, but supporting On the Margin, supporting WPFW is no laughing matter. It is critical to our cultural and political understandings of the world. Ethelbert?
Yeah, I'm having a devil of a good time this morning.
Oh boy.
Oh boy. James, you mentioned as we talk about Bernice Reagon, you talked about Vincent Harding, and I also want to talk about not just Vincent Harding, but also Rose Harding, and then I want you to also talk about two other people, actually maybe three other people that had an influence on Bernice, and that's Pete Seeger and his wife Toshi, and then also Ella Baker, who was I think Bernice would call her, that would be Bernice's political mother. Ella Baker was the first executive secretary of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and she died in 1986. But talk about those individuals, not just Vincent Harding, but Rose Harding, and also
Right.
not just Pete Seeger, but Toshi Seeger, and then Ella Baker.
So Black women are central to the identity of Bernice, both as an individual being a woman, but also in terms of the Black community, the role of Black women in the church, notwithstanding the fact that her father was the minister of the church. It is, and she documents this in her own words, drawing on the history of the participation and the voice and the contributions of Black women. I don't know how my mother walked her troubles down. I don't know how my father stood his ground, standing in a rainstorm, I do believe, which is one of the documentary elements. Rose Harding, who we need to talk about much, much more. She and Vincent Harding had been invited by Dr. Martin Luther King down to deal with the interracial groupings who were trying to break American apartheid. And so Rose and Vincent were of strong religious grounding. Vincent was a Black Mennonite, and they had a strong faith, but an action-oriented faith. And so Bernice, being in that household as a colleague, she was a student and a colleague. This is the thing that these great scholars always recognize, that here was an organic intellectual, my terminology, if you will, and they collaborated with her, not just teaching her. So both Vincent and Stephen Henderson and Rose Harding, the founding of the Harambe Singers, which predates Sudani and the Rock, a Black women's organization, developed to fund the first interracial preschool in Atlanta. again, women with individualized voices coming into the public space, not as entertainment, but as education. So women were very solidly there. Let me just skip quickly to say that the first Martin Luther King lecture that Ralph Rensler and I did at the Smithsonian, the first lecture was Sweet Honey in the Rock. People were saying, "Oh, this is a concert." I said, "You miss the historical research and the ancestral voices that are brought by these contemporary individualized singers." And that was all the grounding of Bernice. And so this Vincent Harding played a key role. She was one of the founding governing members of the Institute of the Black World, co-founded, really co-conceptualized by Vincent Harding and Stephen Henderson. There were others there, but they were the two principals that initiated that project. And so Bernice was there. Vincent sent us both to the Ford Foundation. That's how we ended up working on PhD. She getting hers, my dropping out.
And talk about Pete Seeger and Toshi Seeger.
So Pete Seeger, it is documented, suggested that the Freedom Singers really become organized. I think this was a gathering at Morehouse College where he heard them and suggested that they be a propagation voice of the civil rights movement moving around the country. And it was Toshi Seeger, Pete's wife and activist partner, who organized a lot of the major venues in New York City, and who had a powerful influence in facilitation and collaboration with Bernice, such that Bernice's first child, the now renowned composer, songwriter, Toshi Reagon, is named after Toshi Seeger, Pete Seeger's wife. And there are these iconic photographs of, Pete Seeger listening to and singing with Bernice. And it opened up a broader progressive and radical context in which I remember her saying to me once, she was singing in New York, and afterwards she was at this party and she asked to use the telephone, and she went back and she called James Foreman and she said, "They're communists in this gathering." So, of course, Pete Seeger always saw himself as a communist in a very popular way. If clean water was about communism, I'm a communist, he would say. But that opened up larger intersection, or reflected a larger intersection between the radical activism and agency of the Black Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, moving into the larger, not just national world, but as Karen Spellman has noted in a recent article in the City paper, Bernice's Pan-Africanist outlook.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk about Ella Baker. We have Ella's song. And I think of also not just Ella Baker, but I'm looking at Fannie Lou Hamer as a singer. And then also another singer, Odetta.
Odetta. Well, Bernice is in that tradition. Consciously, she inserted her voice, her particular tone and sound and outlook in that historical context. She was very much about being a carrier of legacy. And she was very clear that these were models and motivating individuals in the development, not just of her aesthetic voice, her sound, but her thinking about the world and her positioning herself in the social, political context of the world. Bernice, this saying that has just come out recently that Toshi, her daughter, I don't know where it's written down or if just this is from Toshi's memory, but Bernice saying, "I was here before I came.
Right.
And when I die, I'm not
leaving.
I was here before I came." What is that telling us? That there were people before me that have brought me here, that I am really an echo.
You know what it sounds like though? It also sounds like it's a quote, but says Sunra. Sunra says someone left and someone came back only to tell people that he left.
Right. Well, Bernice had a deep, there's a deep meta dimension of Bernice, because in the Journal of American Folklife article that Dr. Amy Horowitz and I authored in honor of commemoration of Bernice's 80th birthday, there is this phrasing where she talks about being a medium. of bringing the voices of the ancestors. So she was a serious historian, but she understood that there was a level of communication with the past. And of course, the women that you name while they were still alive, they preceded her, but she was connected to them and an extension of them, and they were connected to many voices that we don't know before Ella Baker and Fannie Lou, that I think they understood who they were connected to.
You know, when you talk about all these connections, I think of another name that I know was down there at Spelman, and I was wondering if he had an influence on Bernice, and that's Howard Zinn.
Howard Zinn was teaching at Spelman, and he was there when I was a freshman. He came before I was a freshman at Morehouse in 1965. And while I can't speak to the particulars of the relationship between Bernice and Howard Zinn, clearly his engagement with the civil rights movement and the worldview that he had, there was some synergy there, but I don't know the particular intersection between the two of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I want to move up. You know, we were talking, going back and forth. I always am interested. You said that you came up to Washington, D.C. and Howard University. You guys had a little Ford Foundation. Some people said you guys would run out of Atlanta.
Well, no, Vincent, I never really directly talked to Bernice about this, but it was Vincent who called me in one day and who said, Jim, he always called me Jim, I think you should go to graduate school. It's not something I had considered, and I want you to go talk to these people. As he had contacted me earlier when he knew that I had a job, I needed a job. I was down and out, and he had brought me to the Martin Luther King Documentation Project, and then sometimes within that year, he called me and said, go down and talk to the Southern Education Foundation, Eldridge McMillan, an African American who runs that foundation, and they gave me a fellowship. Bernice also had one, which paid my way for Vincent to bring me up to the Institute of the Black World. So Vincent Harding is a grounding element of the development of Bernice, and also had a major influence on my life, although the two of them were much closer than he and I were. But he was a major force in opening up a vision of where we might go and what we might do.
You know, I draw a straight line from Vincent Harding to Andrew Billingsley, because when you're coming up to Howard University, we're now dealing with actually the impact of this Howard University student movement, because we see the removal of President James Nabert and the hiring of James Cheek. And one of the things that Cheek does is hire Andrew Billingsley as the Vice President of Academic Affairs, and Billingsley creates the Institute for Arts and Humanities. Okay, that becomes a very important organization, not just for the National Writers Conferences, but also for the National Folklore Conferences that was held. And I believe that Henderson might have invited Sweet Honey in the Rock to come and perform at one of the beginning of that. But I want to ask you these questions. In what, Jane, in what way is Bernice Reagon a groundbreaking contributor in the fields of folklore studies?
So Bernice had started doing work as early as probably earlier than I know, but 67 and 68, she was doing the Soul Roots festivals with Stephen Henderson at Morehouse in the Atlanta University Center and Spelman. With Anne Romaine in 1966, they started the Southern Folklore Cultural Revival Project, the first interracial folk festivals in the South. Anne Romaine was a very important figure that continued that work for about 25 years. She was out of Appalachia. So Bernice was always researching. She was always observing her environment. It was Roland Freeman, the late Roland Freeman, the African-American photo documentarian of community-based culture, that suggested the organization of the African and African-American folklorists. That's where the idea came from. He said to me, why do Black people not go to the major American Folklore Association meeting, which was not totally true. And so he says he was meeting with Stephen Henderson in a week or so, and I said, why don't you bring it up? So that's where it started. So then Steve Henderson said to me, Steve was my head of the English department when I was at Morehouse, and then of course I was around the Institute of the Black World, and we are both Florida homeboys. And I spent a lot of time as an undergraduate talking with Steve. I wish I remember all of the things. It was not so much academic and intellect, but certainly intellectual, but more social and political. Steve said, Jim, he always called me Jim, we need to have a cultural statement here. And I said, oh, Steve, by the way, Miriam and I were just invited by Bernice to come and see a rehearsal of the workshop group at the Last Colony Theater, Sweet Honey in the Rock. So in the book, We Who Believe in Freedom, which Bernice edited,
Let me correct that. You said the Last Colony. Is that like the DC Black Repertory Company?
The DC Repertory Theater, I'm sorry.
Okay,
which
all right, okay.
I don't know why I'm the Last Colony. It's an apartment complex now called the Last Colony. But in any event, so I mentioned to Steve, and then Steve extended a paid invitation, so they know it was their first paid gig. But Roland Freeman is the key, and of course Bernice spoke there. So did Leon Contron Damas, who was one of the three major one of the three major figures of Negritude, along with Senghor and Amy
Césaire.
And of course, he was one of our colleagues. We were youngsters. He was here at Howard University, and Steve was there. And
there's one name that just seems to be missing. You made a lot of names, but let me. I'm glad you mentioned Roland. Worth Long.
Wow, Worth Long, who is an institution unto himself, who's still living. He and Roland Freeman were the closest of colleagues. He did groundbreaking work on African-American community-based culture, folk community culture, ordinary everyday people, and the power of their imaginations, their visions, their creativity, their modes of communication, their sense of aesthetics, their common sense, if you will. And so Worth Long, along with Roland and Bernice, are a trio that needs to be studied in the synergy. And so that when Gerald Davis, the late Gerald Davis, who was a graduate student at Rutgers University, also then an associate director of the Festival of American Folklife, came up with the concept of the African diaspora, which Bernice then became the major curator of. Bernice brought in Worth Long, who was, helped to ground that. And people should look at his work, and particularly students who want to look at agency in African-American life from community, from the vantage point of ordinary people. Worth Long is a very important figure in his own right.
Okay, James Early, you're an important figure also. Okay, we'll take a little break here. My guest this morning is James Early, and I introduced him as being the former interim director of the Anacostia Museum and many other things. But the station is WPFW, and we're in the middle of a fundraising drive. And Katia, do you want to join us at this little interval?
I would love to, Ethelbert. We are still in need of $500 this hour, 800-222-9739. Although I do understand the conversation is so interesting that it's hard to break away and make that pledge of support. But we ask you right now to support that which supports you. Ethelbert's program does that every week on the margin. 800-222-9739, WPFWFM.org. What can be more wonderful than supporting him on a day where we're talking about Dr. Bernice, the beloved Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagon, and really delving into her life and her not only the things that influenced her, but her influences on others. There are so many who were touched by her, and I'm sure this is a conversation where you're learning a lot. And it's really fascinating. So make that call that makes the difference. You make everything here at WPFW possible. We love the fact that Ethelbert comes to us every Thursday morning at 9 a.m. And so do you. So please make a contribution during our summer membership drive, 800-222-9739 or WPFWFM.org.
Okay. Thank you, Katia. Many people know I don't know how to drive, but Katia, I don't know who's pledging because I can't see the screen.
That's okay. I'm going to keep you up to date. I promise. That's what you had me for.
All right. That's why. That's why you're at the wheel. Okay. Okay.
And so, Ethelbert, permit me to say to the audience: listen, you can multitask. You can listen to this program and pledge at the same time. This is a very important public space, not just for your listening pleasure, but for your voicing. We're talking about a woman who talked about voice, that everybody has a voice, and it's the sound of your own voice. So make it known by supporting this program. And if you happen to miss something, it will be recorded. So please support this station.
Okay, James, there's something I want to ask you about that you're making reference to Amy Horowitz. You guys produced a good overview of Bernice's work in the winter 2023 issue of the Journal of American Folklore. Did you have to lobby to get that essay into the American Journal of American Folklore? And how important is that to be for Bernice to have that presence in that type of publication?
No, we did not really have to lobby. The editor-in-chief, Lisa Gilman, who was at the folklore program at George Mason University, readily accepted the invitation. We would not have been able to finish this project without her continued facilitation and support and editorial advice. And so Amy Horowitz is who probably has followed Bernice's work in various dimensions more so than anyone that I'm aware of, is the one who got me involved in the project, and she led the project. Although by way of a convention of American publications, my name comes first because it's E before H. It's really should be H before E. It's Amy Horowitz who really set this up, and so we didn't have any problem doing that. We wanted to do this project to really stimulate the interest of a new generation of students and scholars to study Bernice's work as a scholar, because we think that's an underlooked element of, and it's a fulcrum. She was always a scholar even before she had these degrees. She was always researching, documenting, comparing, and out of that, her individual voice and creativity was informed. And so that's how this came to pass. We did not try to do a definitive view. We're just trying to stimulate this. We were also very cognizant of that we are extremely close to the presence of Bernice Reagon, and we didn't want to wanted to avoid a hagiographic kind of piece. And so we didn't try to do a definitive piece. This is an invitation for people to do that research.
Talk more about Amy Horowitz, and also talk about her work with the Smithsonian Folkways recordings, and then also mention the importance of Barbara Dane.
So Amy Horowitz, who's former interim acting director, I can't remember the qualifying title of Folkways Records, issue Give Your Hands to Freedom, was worked with Bernice. They're the founders of Sister Fire and Roadwork at a time when women's music, particularly gay women, not exclusively gay women, but specifically gay women, voices were not in the public space. And Bernice and Amy opened that institutional element up. Ralph Rensler, who was co-founder of the Festival of American Folklife and the later Assistant Secretary for Education and Public Service, where he invited me to come as his deputy, was key in also helping to develop the Roadwork project. And that album that Amy reissued is critically important. Barbara Dane, who was the first freedom singer to go after the Cuban Revolution, who's now 96, is a film documentary out on her life, and her autobiography is out, was the key founder of Paradigm Records, and her husband, the late Erwin Sober, who had written on labor songs, and who Paul Robeson and Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger, not Bob Dylan, Pete Seeger, had asked to found Sing Out magazine. This is a historical legacy, if you will, and Barbara Dane played a very important role in that documentation. Paradigm Records is the Smithsonian, the Folkways Records collects record companies of community-based expressions and the like in music, and so it is at the Smithsonian Institution.
Yeah, I wrote the liner notes for
Yes, you did.
Hands to Struggle, and I think I was only able to write that because I was not at Howard University. I was a visiting professor down at Emory Henry College, and I had the time to really get into writing a long piece, and I'm very happy to do that.
You also wrote a piece for one of the important documents that people should look at. Bernice as a scholar, written in 1985. Black American Culture and Scholarship, Contemporary Issues. You have an article in there. I think this is the first time I published something that sort of foreshadowed my interest in cultural policy without having a clear framework at that point. But this is a part of her groundbreaking scholarship. And I just want to mention, you know, she did in 1970 curating before she came to Howard. She curated a program at the Smithsonian, Black Music Through the Languages of the New World. Again, this is before she started working on a PhD. And then, of course, the Festival of American Folklife, which I said Gerald Davis was a major conceptualizer of, which explored contemporary and historical relations between Black American performance and cultural traditions, and those emanating from the African Caribbean and African Latin communities of the continent. This is where Bernice found her voice at, and she documented this. She finds her voice as a scholar, as a historian. It was through that program that she got some clarity on where she was going to go. And of course, then later she finishes her PhD at Howard on music of the Black Freedom Movement.
You know, her voice was at my wedding back in September 1982. She sang at my wedding. But what was very interesting, you know, she also composed a song in honor of my daughter who was being blessed and baptized. And that's when I got a sense of Bernice as a songwriter. You know, what she had to do, she had to come over and spend time with me and Denise, like to get the vibe. Like I'm just not gonna give you my voice. You know, I want to know who you are, you know. And that's the process. And I think in my lifetime, I don't know how it is with you, Jane, the two people who I really admire in terms of like the topical, you know, songwriter was Bernice Reagon, you know, Bernice Reagon and Gil Scott-Heron, you know.
Yes, they were both attuned to the nuance and the context in which they lived, and they were both voices that uplifted your spirit, but also brought a public education about power relationships and about the need to put forth one's own voice. And so that, you know, with Gil Scott, we could dance and shake our booties, but in our ears was going a really public political education and ideological.
And I want to tell the audience, I do have a recording of you shaking you and your wife shaking your booties.
Well, in the tradition, and of course, when you would go to hear Bernice Reagon, and I'll use Sweet Honey in the Rock as the key example because my children, our adult children, and I often talk about this, is that you would look around and say, wow, I'm not used to being next to these people. Who were those people? They were church ladies and old ladies in hats, and
well, let's look at that. Look at that. You mentioned like the hats or the crowns, you know, that we
right.
But let's also talk about something which is mentioned in you know, Bernice's look at that the clothes that Sweet Honey and the Rock was wearing. Okay, I mean, to me, when they come out, they look like oracles. You know, I mean, you know,
Yeah,
they look like this is before the Black Panther movie. You know,
well, because they were tied into other creative elements of our community, like January Umoja,
right?
Of course, and then January Umoja was also doing work with Sun Ra. You know, so there. What is the beauty and the creativity that emanates from the community? Bernice probably organized, this is my speculation, the first major exhibit on Black hair braiding, in which Niani Kilkenny is a source that we should be talking to at some point about documenting that. Yeah, so this was a part of Bernice's horizontal intersection with all dimensions of Black life, of women life,
Well, let's expand that because you know talking about Black women, but let's bring in the roadwork and Sister Fire.
Well, Roadwork and Sister Fire, and this is where Amy Horowitz is really so pivotal. Of course, she was uplifted by Bernice's creativity, and she worked with Sweet Honey and Rock over a number of years. But it was a collaboration between those two women who opened up a public space for women's voices that were not really foregrounded in the public space, particularly lesbian women, but not exclusively lesbian women. Our children, our two boys were very, very young. I think they were the first males on stage at Sister Fire, and went to the first males to be in a children's recording with Sweet Honey and The Rock. So Amy is a central force in collaborating with Bernice and institutionalizing the kind of community-based work. And that's a thesis in and of itself that some undergraduate, some graduate student out there, some pre or postdoc should be looking at to do documentation on.
Well, another thing that needs to be documented, talk about the collaboration between Bernice Reagon and June Jordan.
Yeah, well, you should talk about that. I mean, you introduced me to June Jordan, and your relationship to June Jordan, again, a singular kind of relationship, both in terms of your social bonding, but in terms of your creative, poetic expressions. So you should.
Well, you know what? I was amazed, and I was always amazed by this. And I talked to Bernice about this. June sends her a letter. June sends her a letter, and Bernice says, "Oh, I can sing this."
Yes.
And we get ought to be a woman. I'm not saying, and I've written a lot of letters. You know what I'm saying? I want to send a letter to Smokey Robinson and see whether he can sing this letter. I mean, I when she said that, I'm like saying, what is she seeing that that she can say, I can sing this.
Well, I that's a great what is that verb, sing, that you mentioned. Bernice had an extraordinary capacity to see and to feel and to give voice to on the moment. I can remember her saying, "Oh, this song was made up. I was on my way to a demonstration, driving in my car, and I composed this song." She had that unusual, extraordinary ability, which was always grounded in what has gone on with our people fighting against slavery, what has gone on with women, what is going on at the time, whether it's Chile or what is run deep through Soweto, where she's looking at what's happening in Chile with what was happening in Soweto. Give Your Hands to Struggle, the Vietnam movement, the people of the world are finally taking a stand. Where will you, America, be next time? She was analytical. The song about the blouse that she took from an essay of John Cavana at the Institute of Policy Studies, where she did a sabbatical. I have an email from John that documents that, how Bernice would come and talk to the staff, and then how she drew on that essay, and where it ends, "Are your hands clean?" where she talks about the exploitation of women and the creativity of these beautiful blouses.
Let's talk about something that only you probably can bear witness, since Bernice is not here with us anymore. I'm looking at how a genius, and we can say genius because of the MacArthur Award, how a person like Bernice Reagon interacts with some of these conservative institutions, whether it's Howard University, whether it's the Smithsonian. There has to be some pushback. We're saying, "Oh, this was nice," but I know, being in some of these meetings, many people are sitting around, they don't get it.
Right. Well, you couldn't push back Bernice Reagon. I mean, when she arrived, just her very physical presence, and then when she opened her mouth, just the sound of her voice. I remember there was a controversy at the Smithsonian. They were renting dormitories out at I think it was Georgetown, and they had a rule that the musicians had to stop at 10 o'clock and go inside to play, particularly drumming. And so there was a big controversy. She asked me to go out there and say to them, "You don't have to stop," and I did. And so the next day there was a meeting about this controversy. And when it was put forth, Bernice spoke. The last time they took the drums from us was in 1619. It just changed the whole tenor, backed everybody up. She spoke with an authority, a validity. James Foreman captures this sureness of direction, unquote, the terminology that he uses to describe her singing and convening with the community. And so that wherever she went, it was going to be a breaking of new ground. And to the credit of her professors, like Stephen Henderson, like Vincent Harding, they recognized that she was not just someone that she could learn something from them. She was one that they could learn something, and that she would lead us into new territory. And Foreman again captures that. He says, until the Albany movement, the freedom songs were not a consistent part of the resistance movement, but it was the voice of Bernice Reagon who grounds that and brings that, and really is a pivot, motivation force for that to become a national phenomenon, along with obviously the other creators of the SNCC freedom singers.
You know, when you talk about that voice of authority, at least one person's voice of authority that I had a chance to witness, and you know him well, but I always associate that voice of authority with Harry Belafonte. You know.
Yes, Harry Belafonte was another reckoning force. You know, I did Karen Spellman called me, I think it was the 25th anniversary of WPFW, asking if I would help to facilitate communication with Harry Belafonte, and I did. And then it ended up that I ended up doing an interview. I thought that PFW was going to do it, but I called it Descent Towards Democracy. He was one of those who walked in the room, and the dissent was there, but it was to open up new ground. When Bernice,
he's responsible for opening that ground for South Africa. I think him and Miriam Makeba, I think, has that influence on Bernice.
Yes, he opened the ground for a lot of the musicians, major musicians. Our brother Gracing in the Grass,
Hugh Masekela.
Hugh Masekela. He was the interlocutor for that. He took Sweet Honey and the Rock to Cuba. But back to Bernice, when Bernice came to Howard in the history department, she rearranged the whole university structure and her interdisciplinary work with the music department and the history department. She and I took the initiative to say, we're not going to sit here for 5 years taking 3-hour courses. So that reading courses was something that I assisted, open that thing, framework up. So Bernice was always a radicalizing force, but not just I am here as an individual. She was always able to tap into who was there and to organize people and to motivate people to move. And she really brought a paradigm shift into the Smithsonian Institution, and where the voices of ordinary people became her colleagues. So the Civil Rights Movement conference, where she had these scholars on stage with these activists, and the scholars had to qualify their vantage points with those of the people who were activists who were not scholars, some who probably had not finished high school. And of course, it was a congregational orientation in the Museum of American History, because sitting in the audience were all these activists who would shout from the audience, no, that was not her uncle, it was her cousin, or whatever the dates or the issues were. And this may be the first sort of collective oral history documentation rather than just individualized history.
Okay.
Out of that congregational methodology that she brought from the church.
Okay. Let's bring the congregation back to the church, the Amen corner, I guess.
Let the church say amen.
Let the church say amen. Preach, sister.
We want to say thank you to some folks, Ethelbert and James. We say thank you to Anonymous out of Bethesda that says, thank you for this wonderful program discussion of Bernice Johnson Reagon's life and activism. Bernice Presente from Rocky. We also want to say thank you to Marjan Shalal. Thank you so much, Marjan. We appreciate you. She says, love this show, love the discussions. And Janice out of Silver Spring, Maryland, leaving us only, thank you for your generous support, leaving us only $205 to go between now and the top of the hour. We have 7 minutes. We can do this for Ethelbert and for James Early. This has been such a beautiful and wonderful program, delving into the life and legacy of Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagon. And we just can't get enough of this history. And if you feel like me and Marjan and Anonymous and Janice, then go to the phones right now. Support that which supports you by calling 800-222-9739 or WPFW-FM, $205 to go. Let's make both James and Ethelbert proud today. Ethelbert?
Okay, let me go back, James, almost to the beginning of our show, and I was reading James Foreman. I saw a picture, I think you put on Facebook, where you are looking at a frame.
30 seconds.
Framing of the Foreman's statement. Is that at the Smithsonian?
Oh, I'm not sure I remember that image.
Yeah, there was a picture of you looking at for me. It's that. But I just want to thank you, James. In terms of, is there any last memory that you would like to share with us in terms of how you feel Bernice Reagon should be remembered?
Well, I was here before I came,
Mm-hmm.
and when I die, I'm not leaving. Her presence is with us in her music, in her research documentation. And I would urge all of you out there to petition the public trust, which is the Smithsonian Institution, to come forth and do a serious dive into her work as a scholar, in which Amy Horwitz, really don't have to be participants because they have all of the expertise there, including many of the colleagues of the Smithsonian Institute.
Okay.
I think this
Her.
is one of the most important steps to be taken to fully understand her presence historically with us and the presence of her still living with us.
Okay. Thank you, James Early, who is the former Assistant Secretary for Education and Public Service at the Smithsonian Folklife Center. Thank you very much. My name is Ethelbert. The show's on the margin. The station is WPFW 89.3 FM.